Well, howdy there, folks. James from Political Friar coming at you again. Most of you know that I started my time looking at the human condition not from the lens of my politics or political analysis, but instead from the lens of a historian. I spent my time in graduate school studying the early 20th century global crisis from World War I through World War II and the lessons that it taught us today, anticipating that a global crisis would inevitably face us again. Now, I'm not at all sure that such a thing is happening today. Actually, I don't think it is. But it did bring me against a popular concept that I think has been very useful over the last 70 years, but may be needing of retirement. And that is Godwin's law. Godwin's law came about in the early days of the internet. It states that as soon as someone brings up the Nazis in support of their argument, they have immediately lost said internet argument. It was a heuristic. It's an acknowledgement that the type of intense horror that the Nazis perpetrated is just aberrant. It's unlikely to repeat. It almost certainly is not repeating in the current time, and therefore the comparisons are not applicable. And it's true. When the Nazis have been invoked to talk about anything in the second half of the 20th century, it's been inapt. None of the actions of the Soviet Union or China have been akin to the atrocities of the Nazis. The only example I can think of that even comes close is Pol Pot in Cambodia. And even that was much more like the Mongols than the Nazis, because the real defining factor of the Nazis is that it was so industrialized and so intentional. It was not a passionate Holocaust. It was a dispassionate one. It was workmanlike, and that was new. That's something that hasn't been seen in human history, and God, I hope it never is again. But the problem with Godwin's law is it conflates the Holocaust, which really has no comparison, and let's hope it never does, with the international crisis that allowed the Holocaust to happen, and that was the challenge to the international order that Germany presented in the early 20th century. And for these purposes, you should lump the Imperial Germans with the Nazis, because it was about revising an international system that arose out of the end of the French Revolutionary Wars. So the international system that arose out of the French Revolutionary Wars was one that was authored by Britain and Austria and Prussia and Russia. And it said that you could have princely wars where territory could exchange hands, but you would never attempt to truly conquer or displace a great power. That is impossible. Also, powers should be able to trade relatively freely, and they should cooperate with each other to prevent mass casualty wars. Little wars, okay. Big wars, not okay. Also accept defeat. These are the things that the international system that Britain authored in Pax Britannica in the 19th century uh, held as true, and these are the principles that the Germans and their allies, fellow travelers in the case of the Japanese, sought to overturn. The Germans sought to go back to a more absolutist type of international conflict where conquest was acceptable, and you really would displace the political elites of the territories that were conquered in favor of your own. What a modern person would call genocide became acceptable, and it wasn't acceptable under the Pax Britannica. And so after World War II, those ideas were abandoned. And we went back to something more akin to the 19th century version of what the international system ought to look like as far as norms, except for more. It became not only unacceptable to have a disruption of a political elite in a territory, but it actually became inappropriate to change the borders by force. And this is something that the Soviet Union and the United States agreed on. The competition between the Soviet Union and the United States was ideological. It could have become military, but it never was really all that close to becoming military. It would have been a mistake. It would have been an accident if a World War II had broken out between the United States and the Soviet Union. Neither side wanted it, and both sides, when faced with the slippery slope, sacrificed to prevent it from happening. The best example of this was obviously in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev famously blinked. Well, he did, but he also got a concession. The nukes that the United States had placed in Turkey were removed, just like the nukes that the Soviet Union had placed in Cuba were removed. That's not well publicized, but it also shows that in the end, neither party was interested in war, because war was something they had experience with. War is not something that this current generation has experience with, not really. And that's why Godwin's law made sense, because anyone speaking about current events today doesn't know what they're talking about. World War II is orders of magnitude more terrible than anything that has happened in anyone's lifetime outside of those few World War II vets who are still with us. And so Godwin's law was a good reminder about, hey, everything you think is happening now is not comparable, except there's a real downside to following Godwin's law, and that's what if? What if you do get an alignment of powers who are willing to push things as far as the Germans and their fellow travelers were in the 20th century? What if the enemy of my enemy is my friend becomes so powerful that you have an imperialist state like Russia, a revisionist state like China, and a terrorist state like Iran deciding that, yeah, this international order that says free trade, don't change borders by force, it's just intolerable. And the risk of self-immolation is worth running to change it. And that's when Godwin's law has its downside, because it can blind us from that analysis. So I think the point of this talk is not so much to say that I think that's what's happening, but it's to say that we shouldn't immediately reject an online commentator who brings up the early 20th century global crisis as a comparison as being wrong, because God forbid that it's right. Anyway, it's just my take. Tell me what you think in the comments down below. Like this video. Please subscribe and tell your friends. Really appreciate it. Thanks.